Have you ever felt invisible? Like no matter how hard you work, how much effort you put in, the world refuses to see your potential. Imagine being surrounded by luxury yet never being allowed to experience it. Imagine serving people who barely acknowledge your existence. Now, what if I told you that today's story is about a woman who went from scrubbing floors in a billionaire's mansion to sitting at the head of the table as the CEO of the very company her employers once owned? Sounds like something out of a fairy tale, right? But trust me, this story is as real as it gets. And the twist will leave you speechless. Meet Maria, a hard-working woman with dreams bigger than the world would allow. Every single day, she worked from sunrise to midnight, cleaning the floors of the Montague family's luxurious mansion. She saw wealth, she smelled it, she served it on a silver platter, but she was never allowed to claim a single piece of it for herself. To the Montague family, she was just the help, someone they barely noticed, someone they never imagined could be anything more. But what they didn't realize was that Maria was listening. Maria was learning, and most importantly, Maria was waiting for the moment to change everything. But life isn't a movie. It's not enough to dream. You have to fight for your dreams. And Maria? Oh, she fought harder than anyone. Because when destiny gave her an opportunity, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed it with both hands and left an entire family in shock. What happened next? Well, you'll have to keep watching to find out. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever felt like people around you don't see what you're truly capable of? If you have, then type yes in the comments right now, because this story is for you. The clock struck 4:30 a.m. The world outside was still asleep, wrapped in the quiet embrace of the early morning. But inside a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of the city, Maria was already up. The sound of her alarm was sharp, cutting through the silence like a cruel reminder of another long day ahead. She sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. Her body ached from yesterday's work, but she didn't have time to rest. Maria had learned long ago that exhaustion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She quickly dressed in her simple uniform, a white blouse and a black skirt, neatly ironed the night before. She pulled her dark hair into a tight bun, ensuring that not a single strand was out of place. The Montague family demanded perfection, even from their maids. She grabbed a piece of stale bread from the counter, stuffing it into her mouth as she rushed out the door. There was no time for breakfast. There was never time for anything. By 5 a.m., Maria was already walking up the long driveway of the Montague mansion, her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. The mansion loomed before her like a castle out of a fairy tale, massive, elegant, and untouchable. It had white marble pillars, golden chandeliers, and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the ground. When the morning sun hit them just right, it was beautiful. But not for people like her. The moment she stepped inside, she ceased to exist as a person. She was no longer Maria. She was the maid. She entered the grand foyer, where the smell of fresh coffee and expensive perfume already filled the air. The morning staff was bustling, chefs preparing gourmet breakfasts, butlers polishing the silverware, and housekeepers fluffing the designer pillows. "Maria, hurry up!" came a sharp voice. She turned to see Veronica Montague, the only daughter of the family. Veronica was beautiful in the way that only privilege could make. Someone beautiful, flawless skin, designer clothes, and an expression that always carried a hint of boredom, as if the world and everyone in it failed to entertain her. "We don't have all day," Veronica snapped, holding up a silk dress. "Steam this before breakfast. And be careful, this costs more than your entire year's salary." Maria took the dress carefully, biting her tongue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing was pointless. The Montagues didn't see her as an equal. She was just another piece of the furniture, another background character in their perfect, polished lives. She moved through the mansion, cleaning, dusting, and polishing every inch of the place until it gleamed. She memorized every routine, every request, every ridiculous demand. By 9 a.m., she was setting the grand dining table for breakfast. The Montagues didn't just eat, they dined. The table was always a masterpiece, with imported French china, golden cutlery, and freshly cut orchids in crystal vases. Maria worked silently as the family gathered, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings. They talked about investments, vacations, and extravagant parties. They never noticed her, except for one person, Mr. Montague himself. The patriarch of the family was nothing like his spoiled children. He was a man of power, but also of wisdom. Unlike the others, he didn't treat Maria as if she were invisible. He watched her, studying her movements, noticing things that others ignored. One evening, as she was cleaning the grand staircase, he spoke. "Maria, do you ever think about your future?" She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She looked up at the old man, his sharp blue eyes filled with curiosity. "My future, sir?" she asked, unsure of what he meant. "Yes," he said, leaning on his cane. "Is this all you want? Do you dream beyond these walls?" Maria felt a lump in her throat. Of course, she had dreams. But what was the point of dreaming when life had already made its decision for you? She forced a polite smile. "My future is here serving your family, sir." Mr. Montague sighed, almost disappointed. "No dream bigger than this?" She didn't answer. Because what could she say? That she had always wished to study? That she had always been fascinated by the business talks she overheard at the dinner table? That, in another life, she might have been sitting at that table instead of serving it? She quickly looked away, pretending to focus on dusting the staircase. "I see," he murmured before walking away. Maria exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the strange feeling in her chest. She wasn't meant for more than this. She was just a maid. Or at least, that's what she thought. Have you ever felt like life had already decided your fate for you? Like no matter how much you dream, reality keeps pulling you back? Tell me in the comments. Because Maria's story is about to take a shocking turn. Maria walked home that night with heavy steps, her shoes scuffing against the pavement as the city lights flickered around her. The laughter from the Montague party still echoed in her ears, the humiliation clinging to her like a second skin. She's just a maid. Jonathan Montague's voice played over and over in her mind, like a cruel record stuck on repeat. She should have been used to it by now. After all, she had heard similar things before, but tonight felt different. The words didn't just sting, they awakened something deep inside her. A fire, a hunger, a refusal to stay in the place they had assigned her. As she reached her small apartment, she didn't immediately go inside. Instead, she stood at the doorstep looking up at the sky. The same sky that stretched over the Montague mansion. The same sky that stretched over the entire city. And yet they lived in two different worlds. Maria exhaled sharply. No more. That night she didn't cry. She didn't wallow in self-pity. She planned. Step 1. Learning from the shadows. Maria didn't have money for college. She didn't have business connections. She didn't even know where to start. But she had access. For years, she had served the wealthy, overhearing conversations about stocks, investments, and high-stakes business deals. She had polished the massive wooden table where multi-million-dollar decisions were made. She had poured coffee for CEOs, watched them laugh as they discussed how to make fortunes. She had been invisible, but she had been listening. And now, she would use every single thing she had ever overheard to her advantage. Maria began stealing knowledge the way others stole riches. During the day, she cleaned the Montague mansion like always. But at night, she studied. She borrowed books from the library, finance, leadership, business strategy. She scribbled notes late into the night, her candle flickering as she forced herself to memorize economic terms she barely understood. She watched free online business courses on an old phone with a cracked screen, pausing every few seconds to take notes. She listened to Montague's investment meetings while dusting the bookshelves, memorizing every term, every technique. She watched how the rich thought, how they strategized, how they manipulated the market. And she learned every single day, because knowledge was power. And for the first time in her life, she was taking it. Step 2. Saving like her life depended on it. The next challenge was money. Maria earned barely enough to survive, let alone to invest in anything substantial. So she cut out every unnecessary expense. She stopped taking the bus, choosing instead to walk 5 miles to work. She ate rice and beans every night. She refused to buy new clothes, stitching her old uniforms together when they tore. Every single coin she didn't spend went into a tiny metal box under her bed. It wasn't much at first. A few crumpled bills, some coins. But week after week, month after month, it grew. And Maria didn't just save, she found new ways to earn. She started offering cleaning services to other wealthy homes after her shift at the Montague mansion. She took on sewing work, fixing old clothes for neighbors. She even learned the art of flipping cheap furniture, buying old chairs from thrift stores, fixing them up, and selling them for a small profit. Her hands were blistered. Her body was exhausted, but her savings box grew heavier. And one night, after nearly 2 years of sacrifice, she opened the box and counted everything. She had saved enough to make her first investment. Step 3. The night that changed everything. Maria thought she had been careful. She thought no one had noticed her quiet rebellion. She was wrong. One night, after the Montague family had gone to sleep, she was tidying up the library when she felt a presence behind her. She turned and froze. Mr. Montague stood there watching her. For a moment, there was silence. Then he stepped forward and placed a heavy book on the desk in front of her. "Maria," he said, his voice steady, "if you're serious, read this." She hesitated. The book was thick, leather-bound, and old. She traced the title with her fingers. "The Art of Investments and Wealth Building." She looked up at him, confused. Why was he giving her this? He simply smiled. "I've been watching you. You're not like the others." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she was too afraid to break the moment. Instead, she clutched the book tightly, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you, sir." He nodded. "Don't thank me. Just don't waste the opportunity." That night, Maria didn't sleep. She devoured every page of the book, reading under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. And she didn't stop. She kept reading. She kept learning. She kept saving. Until the day came when her knowledge and the trust of one unlikely mentor would change her life forever. What would you do if someone handed you an opportunity, but it required everything you had? Would you take it, or would you let fear hold you back? Let me know in the comments, because Maria's moment of truth is coming. The air inside the Montague mansion was unusually heavy. Gone were the usual sounds of laughter, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, the effortless conversations about luxury and business deals. Instead, silence hung over the grand estate like a thick fog. The reason? Mr. Montague died. The news had spread through the city like wildfire. One of the most powerful business magnates, the man who had built Montague Enterprises from the ground up, was gone. His funeral was extravagant, attended by politicians, celebrities, and some of the most influential figures in the business world. Reporters surrounded the mansion, speculating what everyone inside was already thinking. Who would inherit the empire? Inside the mansion, the family gathered in the massive study, waiting for the reading of the will. The atmosphere was tense. Veronica sat with her arms crossed, her diamond bracelet catching the dim light. Jonathan, dressed in a sharp black suit, leaned against the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Other distant relatives had flown in from across the world, all hoping for a piece of the fortune. And then there was Maria. She stood in the corner, her uniform neatly pressed, her hands folded in front of her. She wasn't supposed to be in the room. Maids didn't get invited to moments like this, but the lawyer had specifically asked for her presence. She swallowed hard, keeping her face neutral, though her heart pounded against her ribs. The room fell silent as Mr. Whitmore, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He unfolded the document with precision, taking his time. The tension was suffocating. As per the final will and testament of Mr. Richard Montague, the estate and assets will be distributed as follows, he began. Everyone leaned in. To my family, I leave 5% of Montague Enterprises. A murmur spread through the room. Jonathan frowned. Only 5%? Veronica's eyes narrowed. The lawyer continued. To my employees, I leave generous severance packages as a token of my appreciation for their years of service. More nods, but no surprises yet. And then came the bombshell. To Maria Alvarez, every head in the room snapped toward her. Maria's body stiffened. She wasn't breathing. I leave 51% of Montague Enterprises and my personal mentorship fund. Silence. Dead, unbelieving silence. For a few seconds, it was as if time had stopped. And then chaos erupted. What? Veronica shot up from her seat, her chair scraping against the polished floor. That's impossible. This has to be a mistake, Jonathan added, his voice sharp, his knuckles turning white as he clenched the armrest. The distant relatives whispered furiously among themselves. The Montague empire, worth billions, had just been handed over to a maid. A maid? Maria's head spun. She felt the blood drain from her face. There must be some misunderstanding, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the lawyer was unfazed. He adjusted his glasses and continued, his tone firm. Mr. Montague was of sound mind when he drafted this will. His decision is final. Maria Alvarez is now the majority shareholder of Montague Enterprises. Maria couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her owning Montague Enterprises? She had spent years cleaning the floors of this house, years being treated like she was invisible. And now, she owned it? The betrayal on Jonathan's face turned to rage. She's a nobody! A servant. She doesn't know the first thing about running a company. The lawyer remained calm. That is not for you to decide, Mr. Montague. Your father believed she was the right person to carry on his legacy. Veronica scoffed. This is a joke. An actual joke. What did she do? Manipulate him? Seduce him? There's no way he did this willingly. Maria's stomach twisted at the accusation. Jonathan took a step toward her, his face inches from hers. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. You will never be one of us. Maria looked into his eyes, those same eyes that had mocked her at the party. The same eyes that had looked down on her like she was nothing. She felt the fire inside her reignite. She had been silent her whole life. She had accepted every insult, every humiliation, but not today. Maria squared her shoulders and spoke for the first time. I don't want to be one of you. Jonathan froze. The entire room went silent again. Maria turned to the lawyer. Her voice was shaky but strong. What do I need to do next? The lawyer nodded in approval. First, you'll need to meet with the board. They will need to see that you are serious about taking on this role. Maria took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of every doubt, every hateful stare, every whispered insult pressing down on her. But she refused to let it crush her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a CEO, and she was about to prove everyone wrong. What would you do if you suddenly inherited billions? Would you walk away, or would you fight to prove yourself? Tell me in the comments, because Maria's battle is just beginning. The first morning Maria walked into Montague Enterprises. She felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for her. The towering glass skyscraper loomed above her like a giant. A symbol of everything she had once believed was out of reach. The gold-plated Montague Enterprises sign shimmered in the early morning sun, reflecting the power and prestige of the company she now owned. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped through the revolving doors into the grand lobby. Inside, everything was pristine, cold, and perfect. The marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers, and employees dressed in tailored suits moved with purpose, their conversations sharp and efficient. But the moment Maria walked in, everything stopped. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers spread like wildfire. Is that her? The new CEO? You mean, the maid? Maria heard it all. The skepticism, the disbelief. But she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and kept walking. She wasn't the same woman who had scrubbed floors in silence. She wasn't the same person who had been humiliated at the Montague mansion. She was Maria Alvarez, and she was here to stay. Maria took the elevator up to the top floor, her fingers tightening around the small notebook she had brought with her. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reading every business report, every financial statement. She wasn't just going to sit in that CEO chair, she was going to earn it. As she stepped into the boardroom, a long table stretched before her, surrounded by the most powerful executives in the company. Men in expensive suits sat with their hands folded, their expressions unreadable. At the head of the table sat Mr. Preston, the oldest and most experienced board member. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his sharp blue eyes scanning Maria with quiet judgment. Jonathan Montague sat to his right, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. Maria knew exactly what he was thinking. She doesn't belong here. She's going to fail. She took her seat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of decades of tradition and power pressing down on her. Mr. Preston cleared his throat. Ms. Alvarez, before we proceed, I must ask, do you truly believe you are qualified to lead this company? The room fell silent. Jonathan leaned forward, amusement dancing in his eyes. Come on, Maria. Running a business isn't like scrubbing floors. Do you even understand how profit margins work? Soft chuckles rippled through the boardroom. Maria didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out the financial report. She had been studying all night and slid it across the table. Not only do I understand profit margins, Jonathan, she said calmly, but I also noticed that this company has been losing revenue in 3 key areas: wasteful spending on outdated marketing strategies, underutilized assets in international expansion, and an inefficient supply chain that's costing us millions per quarter. Jonathan's smirk vanished. Mr. Preston raised an eyebrow, flipping through the report. The other board members glanced at each other, their amusement turning into curiosity. Maria continued, her voice steady. I've already developed a strategy to fix these issues. If implemented, we can increase profitability by at least 12% within the next fiscal year. The room was dead silent. Maria felt her heart pounding. This was it. The moment that would define her. Mr. Preston slowly put the report down, his piercing gaze locked onto her. Then, he nodded. Impressive, he murmured. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Maria knew what he wanted. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to panic, stutter, and prove that she didn't belong. But Maria had spent years being ignored, overlooked, underestimated. And now, she was in control. Despite the small victory in the boardroom, Maria knew she had another battle to fight, winning over the employees. They didn't trust her. They didn't believe in her. To them, she was still just a maid. And so Maria did something no CEO had ever done before. She walked the floors of the company, visiting every department. She sat with the customer service team, listening to their frustrations about outdated software that slowed their efficiency. She spent time with the warehouse workers, learning how logistical errors were costing the company millions in lost inventory. She spoke to the janitors, the security guards, the assistants, people who, like her, had always been invisible. And as she listened, something incredible happened. The employees started to see her differently. She wasn't a Montague heir. She wasn't some cold executive in an expensive suit. She was one of them, a leader who actually cared. And slowly, the whispers of doubt began to fade. People started greeting her with respect. Employees who once avoided her gaze now nodded in approval. And within months, productivity at Montague Enterprises skyrocketed. Maria wasn't just running the company, she was transforming it. But not everyone was happy. Jonathan Montague watched it all unfold with growing rage. For years, he had assumed he would inherit everything. He had laughed at Maria, humiliated her, and dismissed her. And yet, here she was, winning. His jealousy turned into desperation, and desperation made him dangerous. Behind the scenes, Jonathan started plotting. He bribed reporters to spread rumors about Maria's past, implying she had manipulated his father into giving her the company. He tried to sabotage major deals, whispering into the ears of investors that Maria was incompetent. But what he didn't realize was that Maria had been paying attention all along. She knew how people like him operated. And so, when Jonathan made his final move, attempting to forge documents to push her out, Maria was 3 steps ahead. She gathered evidence, witness statements, digital records, everything she needed to expose him. And when the board confronted him, there was nothing he could do. Jonathan Montague was removed from the company. He had spent his life believing he was better than her. And yet the woman he had called just a maid had just taken everything from him. The day Jonathan was escorted out of Montague Enterprises, Maria stood in the CEO's office, looking out over the city skyline. It felt surreal. She had spent years cleaning floors in this building. And now, she owned it. A soft knock at the door made her turn. An assistant stepped in, holding out a golden nameplate. She took it in her hands, her breath catching as she read the words. Maria Alvarez, Chief Executive Officer. She ran her fingers over the engraved letters, a quiet smile spreading across her face. She had been laughed at. She had been underestimated. She had been nothing. And now, she was unstoppable. What would you do if everyone doubted you, but you had the chance to prove them all wrong? Would you fight? Would you rise? Let me know in the comments, because Maria's story proves that anything is possible. The city skyline stretched before her like an endless ocean of twinkling lights. Maria stood in front of the massive glass windows of her office, the reflection of her own face staring back at her. She hardly recognized the woman looking at her, Gone was the timid maid who had once scrubbed these very floors in silence. Gone was the woman who had lowered her eyes, too afraid to meet the gaze of the people who ruled the world. Now, she was the CEO of Montague Enterprises. She let out a slow breath, pressing her fingertips against the cool surface of her golden nameplate. Maria Alvarez, Chief Executive Officer. 3 years ago, she had been serving coffee in this very building. Now she ran it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle in. The journey had been unbelievably hard. The sleepless nights, the whispered doubts, the outright hostility from people who wanted her to fail. But she hadn't. She had risen, and she had proven them all wrong. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and a young janitor stepped inside hesitantly. He looked nervous, holding his hat in his hands, his uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. "Ms. Alvarez, I hope I'm not interrupting," he stammered. Maria smiled warmly. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" The young man swallowed hard, his hands tightening around his hat. I wanted to say thank you." Maria tilted her head. "Thank you? For what?" He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "For proving that people like us can be more." Maria's heart clenched. She knew that feeling. She knew what it was like to be told that you would never be more than what you were, to have people look through you instead of at you. "What's your name?" she asked. "David, ma'am." Maria nodded. "Well, David, tell me, what do you dream of doing?" David hesitated. Then finally, in a quiet voice, he said, "I want to study business. I want to be something more than a janitor." Maria's smile grew. "Then you will," she said firmly. David blinked. What?" Maria stood, walking over to her desk and pulling out a small golden card. She handed it to him. "This is my direct line. Every Monday at 6 a.m. before office hours, you will meet with me for 1 hour. I will mentor you, teach you everything I know." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd do that for me?" Maria chuckled. "David, someone once did it for me." His hands shook as he took the card. Hope flickered in his eyes, the same kind of hope Maria had once clung to. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't waste this opportunity." Maria nodded. "I know you won't." As David left, she turned back to the window, her own reflection merging with the city lights. This was her true legacy, not the company, not the billions, not the power, but the change she could create in others. That evening, as Maria was packing up for the night, she noticed an old envelope sitting at the edge of her desk. Her brows furrowed as she picked it up. The paper was aged, the ink slightly faded. She turned it over. Her heart stopped. The letter was from Mr. Montague. Hands trembling, she carefully opened it, unfolding the crisp paper inside. "Maria," it began, "if you are reading this, then I'm no longer here. But if you are reading this from the CEO's desk, then I was right about you all along." Her breath hitched. "You were never just a maid. You were never just the help. You were always more. You just needed the opportunity to prove it to the world." Maria felt her throat tighten. "I chose you not because I felt sorry for you, but because I believed in you. And I hope that now, finally, you believe in yourself too. Lead with wisdom, lead with heart, and never forget where you came from. The world belongs to those who dare to reach for it. Reach, Maria." Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She traced the signature at the bottom, Richard Montague, and let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. Maria picked up her phone and sent a message, one that had been a long time coming. "To everyone who doubted me, thank you. You gave me the fire to prove you wrong." She hit send. And with that, Maria Alvarez, once a maid, now a CEO, stepped out of her office, not as someone who was handed success, but as someone who had earned every single piece of it. She wasn't just a leader. She was living proof that no one's future was set in stone, not hers. And not yours. What's your dream? And what's stopping you from chasing it? Let me know in the comments, because Maria's story proves that nothing is impossible if you refuse to give up. Maria's journey is a reminder that our past does not define our future. The world may doubt you, but what matters is that you don't doubt yourself. If this story inspired you, hit that like button subscribe for more heartwarming stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. See you in the next video. And remember, you are capable of more than you think.